From the American Experience Storybook, Douglas MacArthur, 1880 to 1964. Duty, honor, country, those three hallowed words reverently dictate what you ought to be, what you can be, what you will be. They are your rallying point to build courage when courage seems to fail, to regain faith when there seems to be little cause for faith, to create hope when hope becomes forlorn. Sylvanus Thayer Award acceptance speech to the cadets of the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, New York, May 12, 1962. Given his life as a dedicated advocate for peace and freedom, it seems appropriate that Douglas MacArthur was born on a military base. Ever since he sought ways to serve his country militarily, doing what he believed was right, even if it meant losing his position. In 1903, Douglas graduated from West Point Military Academy with honors and went into the Army Corps of Engineers. In the First World War, Douglas became a colonel and led the 42nd Rainbow Division, nicknamed for its diversity. The men in this division came from all over America. After World War I, Douglas was appointed Army Chief of Staff, charged with keeping the Army professional and effective during the Great Depression. 5 years later, President Franklin Roosevelt sent Douglas to the Philippines to establish a military force. When the Army wanted to bring Douglas home, Douglas insisted that his work in the Philippines was not finished. He resigned from the Army to stay and help Philippines President Manuel Quezon. After being called back to active duty, Douglas played notable roles in both World War II and the Korean War. In the Second World War, Douglas worked in the Pacific trying to ward off Japanese advances. He personally accepted Japan's surrender in 1945 and stayed in Japan to monitor peace and restoration. In the Korean War, as commander of the United Nations forces, Douglas demanded that the United States acknowledge China as an official part of the war until President Truman relieved him of command. Douglas spent his later years chairing a company called Remington Rand, which made typewriters and early computers. The following excerpt is from Reports of General MacArthur, Volume 1, The Campaigns of MacArthur in the Pacific, Chapter 8, The Leyte Operation. Strategic Value of Leyte. The Leyte Operation was to be the crucial battle of the war in the Pacific. On its outcome would depend the fate of the Philippines and the future course of the war against Japan. Located in the heart of the archipelago, Leyte was the focal point where the Southwest Pacific forces of General MacArthur were to converge with the Central Pacific forces of Admiral Nimitz in a mighty assault to wrest the Philippines from the hands of the enemy. With Leyte under General MacArthur's control, the other islands would be within effective striking distance of his ground and air forces. Leyte was to be the anvil against which he would hammer the Japanese into submission in the central Philippines, the springboard from which he would proceed to the conquest of Luzon for the final attack against Japan itself. Military necessity demanded the Allies achieve a decisive victory on Leyte. General MacArthur and Admiral Nimitz were committed to employ the maximum resources at their command. It was axiomatic, too, that the Japanese would fight to the bitter end to save the Philippines. The war situation had grown progressively worse for Japan, and by the autumn of 1944, her position was both critical and desperate. No longer were the Allies held at the outer periphery of her defense system. They were now poised with their full power at the very threshold of her inner structure. And, if they should break through, the home island would stand dangerously exposed, an inviting target for the next invasion. With the initiative entirely in the Allied hands, the war had reached the decisive stage where another important Japanese defeat would seal the ultimate fate of Japan's empire and destroy a centuries-old tradition of invincibility. The Philippines would probably offer the last chance for the Japanese army to recover its lost prestige and gain a victory over General MacArthur's forces. To achieve this victory, the Japanese battle fleet would undoubtedly come forth in full strength to throw back all invasion efforts. If the Japanese were to realize the rapidly diminishing hope of stemming the surging American tide, the decisive battle would have to be in the Philippines. The alternative of failure would be inevitable defeat. The decision had to be pressed. Clearing the Leyte Gulf. The plan for the ground operations and the capture of Leyte comprised four main phases. Phase 1 covered minor preliminary landings to secure the small island lying across the entrance to Leyte Gulf. Phase 2 included the main amphibious assaults on Leyte from Dalag to Tacloban and called for the seizure of the airstrips, an advantage through Leyte Valley, and the opening of San Jacinto and Panawan Straits. Phase 3 consisted of necessary overland and shore-to-shore operations to complete the capture of Leyte and the seizure of southern Samar. Phase 4 contemplated the occupation of the remainder of Samar and the further neutralization of enemy positions in Visayas. The first landings to mark the invasion of the Philippines were made on three small islands which guarded the eastern approach to Leyte Gulf. Despite cyclonic storms and heavy seas, elements of the 6th Ranger Battalion, augmented by one company of the 21st Infantry, went ashore on Sulan and Dingagat Island on 17 October 1944. Heavy mist shrouded their approach, and they were opposed only by the rough surf and battering winds. Hamahan Island was occupied the next day. All three islands were quickly cleared of small enemy garrisons and radio installations, while minesweepers and demolition teams cooperated to sweep the waters and the beaches of all obstacles potentially dangerous to the main operation. The return of MacArthur. On 20 October, the largest mass of naval assault craft and warships ever concentrated in the Pacific sailed boldly into Leyte Gulf. The landing beaches and tactically important rear areas had already been softened by continuous 2-day ship and plane bombardments. Original footnote. The severity of this bombardment accounted in great measure for the initial ease of the Allied landings. In addition to forcing the enemy from many of his beach entrenchments, it seriously disrupted his entire communication system. General Tomochico stated, the position of the 16th Division Artillery Regiment along the first line of defense were subjected to severe pre-landing naval bombardments, which resulted in the destruction of a giant number of its field pieces. Regimental telegraph communications were disrupted by this bombardment, and direct communications with the 35th Army and with the 14th Area Army headquarters in Manila were never re-established. Direct liaison between regiments and smaller units of the division could no longer be carried out effectively. 10th Information and Historical Service, Headquarters 8th Army, Staff Study of Operations of the Japanese 35th Army on Leyte, Part 1R, hereinafter cited as 8th Army Staff Study, Leyte. After an additional morning barrage, the landing troops were ready to go ashore. The main assault on the east coast of Leyte began at 10 o'clock in the morning with landings along an 18-mile front between the two small villages of Dulag and San Jose. 10th Corps, comprising the 1st Cavalry and the 24th Divisions, covered the right flank of the landings to the north. 24th Corps, consisting of the 7th and 96th Divisions, secured the left flank. Both shores of Panawan Strait at the southern tip of the island were seized by a single regimental combat team of the 21st Infantry, which had gone ashore an hour prior to the main assault. General MacArthur's stirring promise to return to the Philippines was fulfilled shortly after the main landings. In a drenching rain, he strode ashore on the muddy beachhead near Paolo, following close to the assault's echelons, and heralded the coming hour of liberation. Speaking to millions of waiting Filipinos over a portable radio set, he declared, "This is the voice of freedom. General MacArthur speaking. People of the Philippines, I have returned. By the grace of Almighty God, our forces stand again on Philippine soil, soil consecrated to the blood of our two peoples. We have come dedicated and committed to the task of destroying every vestige of enemy control over your daily lives and of restoring upon a foundation of indestructible strength the liberties of your people. At my side is your president, Sergio Osmena, worthy successor of that great patriot, Manuel Quezon, with members of his cabinet. The seat of your government is now therefore firmly reestablished on Philippine soil. The hour of your redemption is here. Your patriots have demonstrated an unswerving and resolute devotion to the principles of freedom that challenges the best that is written on the pages of human history. I now call upon your supreme effort that the enemy may know from the temper of an aroused and outraged people within that he has a force there to contend with no less violent than is the force committed without. Rally to me. Let the indomitable spirit of Bataan and Corregidor lead on. As the lines of battle roll forward to bring you within the zone of operations, rise and strike. For future generations of your sons and daughters, strike. In the name of your sacred dead, strike. Let no heart be faint. Let every arm be steeled. The guidance of divine God points the way. Follow in his name to the holy grail of righteous victory. Leyte in retrospect. The battle for Leyte demonstrated to a greater degree than ever before in the Pacific War the coordinated striking power of the American land, air, and naval team. Despite heroic efforts and great courage, despite the use of unprecedented numbers of ships, planes, and troops collected from all parts of their far shrinking empire, the Japanese were unable to stand before the overwhelming drive of American combined arms. The Japanese suffered irreparable defeat in the Leyte campaign. Every phase of their ambitious show plan for the defense of the Philippines met with complete and irretrievable failure. Driven to near panic by the threat of losing the Philippines, Japan's wartime leaders in Tokyo had risked their remaining offensive power in one last effort to save their empire. Whatever chance the Japanese had to regain the initiative in the Pacific was lost on Leyte. In the largest and most widespread sea battle in history, Japan's naval power had been smashed. The losses sustained by the Japanese fleet were among the most staggering on record. After Leyte, Allied warships could sail with impunity anywhere in the Pacific. Japanese air power as an organized force also was destroyed in the Philippines. The employment of planes in suicide attacks not only reflected an extreme shortage of aircraft and trained personnel, but also revealed the desperate plight of the minds that manipulated Japan's war strategy. The kamikaze was the last fierce sputter of a burned out and dying air force. On the ground, General MacArthur's troops met the enemy for the first time en masse, with armies and corps pitted against each other in comparatively free maneuver. The Japanese, determined to retrieve their position at any cost, dispatched troops from China and Manchuria from all corners of the Philippines to the Leyte battlefield. Paralleling their performance in New Guinea and the Solomons, the Japanese yielded nothing without a bitter fight, and it took daring and skillful maneuver on the part of the American soldier to pry them out of their well-prepared positions or break up their desperate counterattacks. All Japanese efforts, however, proved in vain. Their movements were anticipated, their divisions decimated, and their troops forced to flee, starving and demoralized, into the hills and mountains of Inner Leyte. General MacArthur's victory on Leyte was decisive and final. Once more, MacArthur had caught the enemy off balance and had gained decisive advantage of tactical surprise. The Japanese had anticipated an invasion of the Philippines, but they did not know when or where the blow would fall. They were especially unprepared on Leyte. The speed with which the great convoy was unloaded and the rapid drive inland surprised and confused the Japanese. Original footnote: the swift inland drive of the U.S. forces caught the Japanese unawares. "We had thought," said General Tomochico, "that the Allies, after landing, would try to secure their beachheads before proceeding with their advance. However, the enemy rather caught us off guard with their tactic of immediately starting their penetration inland, even before the newly won beachheads had been secured." Interrogation Files, G2, Historical Section, GHQ FEC. In spite of having been constantly outmaneuvered in New Guinea, the Japanese apparently had learned little about the strength and versatility of American air, ground, and naval machine. The Japanese failure on Leyte was also due in great measure to deficiencies in their procurement and intelligence, and by the same token, Allied success owed much to the superior intelligence organization. Original footnote: in a staff study dated 20 September 1944, Japanese Imperial General Headquarters stated, "The enemy has detailed information of our troop distribution in the Philippines." ATIS G2 GHQ SWPA. Current translations, number 148, 6 February 45. Concerning intelligence and operations, General Tomochico declared American intelligence was far superior, that a comparison is useless. "It seemed to me as if we were fighting our battles blindfolded, while the enemy seemed to have 10 times the intelligence we possessed." Major Kazu Tamaguchi, 14th Area Army Staff Officer, acknowledged that the lack of effective intelligence system and the ultimate failure to surmise correctly the mobility and speed of American forces and the time and place of their actual landing attempts was one of the three major Japanese mistakes. Said Colonel Kobayashi, "We had no inside information on American pre-invasion preparations. From ship movements and radio message traffic count, we could estimate the probable site of landings. By past tactics and strategy, we were able to estimate the force, the method of landing, and the time to some extent. We had no other intelligence." Interrogation Files, G2, Historical Section, GHQ FEC. The enemy's piecemeal effort to reinforce Leyte compromised his Luzon defense plan and drained the southern Philippines of combat strength. The cost to the Japanese in their reinforcement attempts was enormous. American air power crippled Japanese convoys, and while some troops were able to make shore, the bulk of combat material and supplies were often lost. Strong reinforcements did arrive at Leyte, but so great were the losses involved that General Yamashita's staff eventually accepted the view that an effective defense of the Philippines, or even of Luzon alone, had become impossible. The Japanese resolution to fight the decisive battle in Visayas had come too late. The battle for Leyte brought other valuable lessons into sharp relief. Although past operations in the Pacific had demonstrated what could be accomplished with controlled air power, Leyte showed how lack of aerial supremacy at a crucial juncture could change the whole complexion of an operation. The definite need for the establishment of forward air bases in the early stages of a campaign was revealed more clearly in Leyte than in any other previous operation. In the European theater, bombers could operate from the same fields over long periods of time in view of relatively short flight distances. But Southwest Pacific air units seldom stayed in one locality more than 2 months before they had to establish new fields 300 to 500 miles away. Consequently, Pacific operations demanded mobile and flexible tactical air combat teams that could transfer their base of operation at a moment's notice to keep pace with the rapid forward strides of General MacArthur's ground forces. The weakness in offensive air power in the early phases of the Leyte operation was directly attributable to adverse weather and difficult terrain. A combination of continuous typhoons, heavy rains, poor drainage, and thick silt formations made it impossible to condition forward airfields as rapidly as the growing scope of the campaign demanded. The Japanese could thereafter carry out their initial reinforcement program with comparable success. As a result, United States ground forces met increasing numbers of enemy troops, and the successful conclusion of the battle was prolonged beyond schedule. The Leyte operation emphasized the inherent risks of divided command. In the naval action, two key American commanders were independent of each other, one under General MacArthur, the other under Admiral Nimitz. Both operated in the same waters and in the same battle. Divided command affected the Allies primarily in the sea fight for Leyte Gulf, but it also ran like a cancer throughout the operations of the Japanese armed forces in the Philippines. The Japanese defeat on Leyte brought American forces almost to the China Sea, placing them in a position to sever the sea routes connecting Japan and her empire to the south. This menace to the safety of her sea lanes drastically reduced the volume of traffic between Japan and her conquered territories. With access to her resources in the Netherlands, East India, and Malaya in danger of being cut, Japan's hope for successfully continuing the conflict were rapidly diminishing. General MacArthur had kept his faith. His return to the Philippines was a dramatic and singular fulfillment of historical destiny. A year before the assault against Leyte, his forces had been deep in the tangled jungles and swamps of New Guinea, almost 1,500 miles from the Philippines. Now he led them into the very heart of the island, into a position to become masters of the archipelago. On the third anniversary of the Japanese attack against the Philippines, General MacArthur's forces were organizing the final blows, which would lead to the capture of Manila and the surrender of General Yamashita's troops on Luzon. The dark shadow of defeat was edging ever faster across the face of the rising sun of Japan. The hour of total eclipse was not far off. Well, I hope you enjoyed that story of General MacArthur from the American Experience Storybook. Please come back for our next one. I love you guys. As Tigger says, ta-ta for now.